Monsieur, dames. Messieurs, mesdames. Chut, exactement. Soyez les bienvenus à Fores. A very warm welcome to Fores, the Green and Liberal Think Tank. Varmt välkomna till Fores. Vi ska fokusera på den stora utmaningen den närmaste timman. Hur kan vi få ett förnybart, klimatsmart och effektivt energisystem på smartaste sätt? Och vi ska göra det på engelska med hjälp av Manuel Baritaud, som är senioranalytiker på IEA, som ska berätta för oss om repowering the energy markets. Manuel kommer att presentera sin sprillans nya studie. Han får själv avslöja hur mycket eller lite han vill varför han i övrigt är i Sverige. Men för oss är det fantastiskt i alla fall att få en inblick i hur man effektivast ställer om energisystemen. Och när Manuel har gjort det, då får vi kommentarer och koka ner det till ett nordiskt och svenskt perspektiv av Birgitta Resvik, som är Head of Corporate Relations på Fortum, och Linda Borenius Magnusson, som är Chief for Public Affairs på OX2. Och sen så får vi Manuel som kommenterar kommentarerna, och sen så får vi våra kommentarer. Och vi gör detta som ni märker på svenska och engelska. If you're more comfortable putting a question in English, that's how you do it. If you prefer att ställa frågan på svenska, så gör ni det, därför att vi har tolkar här framme, och Manuel får också tolkning simultant under tiden när vi har andra kommentarer. But without further ado, after having said thank you so very much to 100% förnybart, 100% renewable, with whom we're co-organizing this event, I want to leave the floor to you, Manuel. A very warm welcome to Forest and to Sweden.
Bonjour, bon après-midi. I will stop my French here. Thank you very much for the invitation to present our recent publication dealing with electricity market design in the context of decarbonization. We've been working on this topic for the last 3 or 4 years now. We presented this publication, we launched it in February. In Brussels, together with the European Commission, so the IEA and the European Commission co-organized a roundtable discussion on electricity market design. And the timing of this report was very good in a European context, because, as you know, we'll work in Europe on a new market design initiative, and the European Commission will propose and come with a legislative proposal on a new market design, among other things, by the end of this year. So I'm very happy to be in this context, because the market design discussion in the recent years has been a little bit confusing from my perspective. A lot of people are discussing how could look like a market design in the longer term once we have a fully decarbonized electricity system. There are a lot of uncertainties regarding how market design could work. We hear a lot of different things. A market design based on marginal cost cannot work with technologies based on high capital intensity and low marginal cost. Whether this is true or not, we'll try to bring some elements of answer to this question. The way we work in this publication is that we looked at experiences in different IEA member countries. We mainly focused on Europe, North America, the US in practice, and some examples in Australia as well. We could have looked at Latin American countries, because very interesting things are going on there. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to do this. So what I will present is mainly based on experiences in IEA member countries. So let me start with this first slide. What is the objective of market design? The market design discussion is not new. We have been discussing electricity market design for 10 to 15 years now. What is really new is that we now need to decarbonize the electricity system. So we place this discussion in this context of decarbonization. And we mainly look at the transition period to low carbon electricity system. We don't discuss a lot the very long-term market design discussion. We focus on transition because this is what governments will have to do in the next 10 to 15 years. They will have to set rules for the transition. So the first objective is to ensure this transition, but this has to be ensured at least cost, and electricity security of supply will remain a very important dimension of this transition. As you know, the IEA is an energy security agency, so we've done a lot of work on this dimension of electricity security of supply. So the key question is to discuss to what extent the current market arrangements are challenged by the need to decarbonize. I will briefly provide you some elements of clarification, I think, regarding the link between technologies and market design. I will then discuss the scope of the work of the publication. Of course, as I have only 20 minutes, I will not have time to go through everything, and I will focus mainly on the question of low carbon generation investments today with you, and say also a few words regarding the design of short-term markets and the question of scarcity pricing and capacity markets. You can ask more questions on this during the discussion after that. So first, I think it's very interesting to establish a link between the market design discussion and the technologies that are available to decarbonize. Very often we have this in mind. We have in mind a world where decarbonization will have to take place mainly based on 100% renewable scenario, and in many countries, perhaps less in Nordic countries, but in many countries, the technologies of choice will be solar PV and wind, which are variable. So we always listen and hear a situation where implicitly people have in mind 100% renewable scenario based on wind and solar power. And in that case, of course, the marginal cost of these technologies is very low, and so it's difficult to see how an electricity system could work based on marginal cost pricing. This has attracted a lot of attention. Whether this scenario is realistic or not, I think it would be extremely costly to go along this route. So a lot of people are looking at how to increase the flexibility of the power system. And by flexibility, I mean demand response, storage, and networks, of course. In that case, if we want to decarbonize with a limited set of low-carbon technologies and a high flexibility of the power system, already we know that the economics of power markets will be different, because you can store, and so you can have a lot of flexibility in the system. The implications of such a technology set on electricity prices are not necessarily that we will have zero prices all the time. But of course, we don't know what will be the cost of storage and demand and the potential of demand response in the future. There is a lot of uncertainty yet regarding these technologies. So we also have to consider situations where we will have a diversified supply of diversified technologies, including biomass, but also CCS, nuclear. And in that case, we came to the conclusion that electricity markets might not be necessarily that different from what we know today. Of course, if we have at the same time a diversified portfolio of technology and a lot of flexibility, the way electricity markets work could be very different and much more similar to what we call commodity, having in mind gas, for instance, where you still have some seasonality, but thanks to storage and flexibility and demand response, the design of electricity markets could be very different. This is the only thing I will say about the very long-term discussion about market design, because the conclusion is that we don't know yet what will be the state of technologies available in the very long term. So from now we focus on the transition to low-carbon power systems, on the transition phase. To set the scene, I think it would be interesting to, present investment numbers taken from the World Energy Outlook. So in the next 25 years, if you look at the investments needed in a 450 scenario in OECD Europe, we will need to invest around $200 billion in conventional capacity. According to these estimates, we'll have to build 66 gigawatts of nuclear, representing $350 billion of investment. But of course, the bulk of and most important part of investment will is expected to come from to be in renewables, wind and solar power, more than 1.5 trillion dollars of investments. To compare this figure, we already spent in Europe $800 billion since 2000. So this means that we'll have to continue to invest and even accelerate the investments compared to what we've done recently, despite the current wholesale price condition. And last but not least, transmission networks continue to represent an important part of investments. And all these investments in OECD Europe will have to take place in competitive electricity markets. So what is the scope of the market design discussion? We distinguish objectives, policy, the different types of regulations that we can use to make this happen, and the type of regulations that we choose has a big impact on the functioning of competitive markets and and the market outcome. So it's very important from my perspective to stop opposing low carbon investments, renewable support schemes, and markets. Given the ambitions that we have in terms of decarbonization, the question of low carbon investments should be an integral part of the market design discussion. We all know that carbon pricing will have a role to play, but we also know that we will have to use additional policy instruments or continue to use them. The other objective, high-level objective of market design is to ensure operational efficiency, reliability, and adequacy. So here again, we have to design well short-term energy market and rely on additional policy instruments such as capacity mechanisms or capacity markets. It's also important to keep in mind that we have to ensure the efficiency of networks, and the main tool here is regulation. And finally, all the different building blocks of market design end up in the bill of final electricity consumers, and so it's important to look at retail pricing. This is, broadly speaking, the scope of the publication. I will not have time to enter into all the details, and I will focus on low carbon generation investments. I'm sorry, I didn't take the evolution of the price in Nordic countries, but I think it's similar. I saw graphs yesterday showing that the prices in Nordic countries are even lower than in continental Europe. So I think this is very valid as well. It's very clear that given the current level of wholesale electricity prices, it will be almost impossible to attract low carbon investments based on these energy market prices only. There are many reasons why these prices are low. If we could increase and strengthen the carbon price, this would be a very good thing. Unfortunately, it will be very difficult to convince investors to make a bet on carbon pricing to attract investments. So even if carbon pricing will be necessary in the future, we don't see this as a tool sufficient to attract low carbon investments, at least during the transition phase, say the next 15 years. It will take time to reestablish the credibility of carbon pricing. And we also know that during the transition, if we want to decarbonize, we need to continue to invest. So the excess capacity in the power system will continue to depress wholesale electricity prices. Therefore, we came to the conclusion that we will continue in a decarbonization scenario to long-term arrangements, and support to low-carbon investment will continue to be necessary, mainly with the objective to keep financing costs low. But of course, you don't have to look only at cost. You also have to look at the value of the investments for the system. I think this graph showing the value factor of wind and solar power is relatively familiar to everybody now. This value factor represents the revenues that you can get from selling the output of a solar or wind plant at market price, divided by the value of the same amount of energy sold at a baseload price. So you see that in most countries, when you start to put solar PV into the system, solar PV produces during daytime when the value of electricity, the market price of electricity is higher, and so you have a value factor above 1. But very rapidly, when you reach 5% of solar PV in the system, the value factor is only 1 on average. So as more you add solar PV into the system, the lower the value factor. These effects have to be captured when deciding to invest in different technologies. This is very important to avoid overinvestment in the wrong technologies that bring less benefit for the system. So at some point, it's better to invest in a technology which has a higher cost on the LCOE, levelized cost of electricity basis, but a higher value for the system, rather than investing in the lower cost technology on the LCOE basis, but which can bring lower value for the system. And participation of renewables and more generally low-carbon electricity sources into markets is one way to make sure that we reveal the value and we capture the value in investment decisions. Of course, we can also work to increase the system flexibility system flexibility in order to maximize the value for the system. But there are also limits on what you can do on this side. I will come back to this later. So the question is how to design low-carbon support instruments in order to keep financing costs as low as possible, while at the same time capturing the value of these different investments. So we are in Sweden. I'm very happy that to be here, because you are familiar with the tradable green certificate system, which are precisely one way to integrate renewables into the market. Most other countries so far have opted for feed-in tariffs, which completely insulate low-carbon generators from any form of investment risk. So the question looking ahead will be to find the better solution between these two extremes. One extreme being no exposure at all to market price risk, so you don't capture any signal from the market. And the other extreme is having a trading green certificate system where you expose low-carbon generators to the entire market price risk, which can lead to higher cost of capital. So we briefly discussed in the report something which is in between these two extremes, which we call a modulated premium system, where the premium is higher when wholesale electricity prices are low, and lower when wholesale electricity prices are high. In practice, you can use a lot of instruments to fine-tune the allocation of risks between generators and consumers. Okay? So very rapidly, this graph represents the load and the net load. We took an example from Germany based on wind, and we scaled up wind generation in Germany. So the blue curve is the net load. And we know that the value and the contribution of wind to resource adequacy to meet peak demand is relatively lower. You are not sure that you will have wind when you have peak demand. We also know that the system will have to become more flexible in order to manage forecast errors of wind, and also to make sure that the system is able to have enough ramping capacity and capability to back up variations in wind. And in order to be able to do that, you need to maintain a certain level of capacity and generation capacity running which leads to situations of over-generation. This is a vocabulary that is used in California, for instance, to describe these situations. Over-generation means, in practice, that you have zero or negative wholesale electricity prices. So you have too much capacity. And this is one of the reasons which explains why the value factor of renewables decline over time with the market share. The next question is, of course, to know where we should put all this new renewable capacity. And for that, you need what we call a market design with a high geographical resolution in order to be able to send the right locational signals. This is true, of course, at continental scale. Should we put solar PV in Sweden or in Spain? Depends on the network, of course. Within existing power systems, we know that it's much faster to deploy renewables than it is to increase the transmission capacity. So if we want to deploy renewables fast, we also have to look where we can put it in the existing system. And increasingly, as we have more distributed energy resources, it will become important to have market price signals and locational signals at the very local level in order to send the right information regarding the value of electricity at the end of the day on each medium voltage feeder, because this can, in theory, go down to this level of detail. Turning now to reliability. I didn't discuss, but maybe we can come to it during the discussion, scarcity pricing. Scarcity pricing is very popular these days in Europe. It was not the case at all when I started to work on this issue 3 years ago, so I'm very happy to see this development. Some people think that we will never see again scarcity prices because we will always be in a situation of excess capacity. Our analysis suggests that overcapacity at some point will disappear as we retire aging capacity. I don't know if it will be in 5, 10 or 15 years from now, but at some point we will have to invest again. So it's important to make sure that we'll be able to have the right scarcity pricing during this hours with capacity shortage. Scarcity pricing has a very important role to play to incentivize demand response, of course. At this stage, we think that the demand response potential is still relatively limited. So here again, there is some uncertainty regarding when we will be able to rely on demand response to be able for each consumers to choose a level of reliability in a way that they want to see. If they are able to respond to scarcity prices, they will be able to choose a reliability level that they want to have. We don't think this is ready yet, so governments still have a role to play to price in reliability on behalf of consumers, and therefore they have to define reliability standards. And all countries are defining reliability standards in different ways. In Europe, for countries where there is a reliability standard, the most popular one is a loss of load expectation, LOLE. In North America, they use a broader concept, which is 1 in 10. It can be 1 hour, 1 event. It's a bit unclear, so it depends how this is applied in practice. I like the way this is defined in Australia, because they've defined this reliability standard in terms of maximum expected unserved energy, and you clearly show that the reliability standard is very high. So it's less scary to say that you will have electricity 99.998% of the time, rather than saying that you will be cut 3 hours per year on average. Which leads to my last slide about capacity markets. As you know, there is a very important discussion in Europe at the moment regarding the design of capacity markets. I will not go into the details. It's very important when we have integrated markets to keep this capacity market at a regional level. And I think it's a very important message to give in Nordic countries. Nordic countries have been at the forefront of market integration. They have been an example for decades now. The next step, if there is a discussion about capacity markets in Nordic countries, this should be a Nordic discussion, not a country-specific discussion, which means in practice that you should, if I may say this, do some regional adequacy forecasts on a regional basis, while of course taking into account the state of the grid. But this should be done on a regional basis. If different products and different mechanisms are implemented in order to ensure the possibility to have cross-border trade of capacity between different countries, it's also important to ensure the compatibility of these different products, which is easier said than done, especially if you want to include demand response into the picture. And in any case, these capacity markets should not interact with the functioning of the energy market, because at the end of the day, what actually matters in terms of reliability and security of supply is how the electricity will flow during hours of scarcity and capacity shortage. And this is not determined by the capacity market. This should be determined by well-functioning electricity markets. And to conclude, so I've put the generic slide that we use in a European context. Decarbonization of the power sector is forcing to rethink market design, I think significantly. It's important at this stage to include low carbon generation investment into the discussion. It's relatively clear that we are moving in a direction with more regulation. So a system with energy on the market plus carbon price will not be sufficient to ensure decarbonization. This being said, we don't need to start from scratch to make this happen, and incremental change and an evolutionary process for market design can ensure the transition. And in a European context, we have three main recommendations. So having a consistent framework that includes at the same time low carbon support, CO2 pricing, and the design of markets. Improve the design of short-term markets, in particular during the very few hours before the time of operations, with the objective also to send locational signals and to increase the geographical resolution of these prices. And last, be clear and have a regional approach for electricity security, which means having well-defined and clear reliability standards, and reliability standards consistent with scarcity prices and capacity markets that can provide an additional safety net in some countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manuel. And now we'll first have two interventions from Birgitta Resvik and Linda Brenius Magnusson, whom will end up with questions for you. And meanwhile, when you start thinking about your own questions, and if you feel shy or feel that you already want to post them, please feel free to put them on Twitter with hashtag Fores, and we'll find them and we'll post them for you. There you can post it in Swedish or French or whatever language of your preference, and we'll make sure it gets to the podium. I'd like to turn to you first, Birgitta, because Manuel was ending up with sort of a Nordic perspective, which is where I expect you to take off from. Yeah, okay. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm coming from Fortum, Birgitta Resvik from Fortum, and it's a Finnish company, and we are operating here in the Nordic, mainly Finland, Sweden, and then the Baltics, Poland, Russia, and also India. So we can see different markets, and we have learned from that. Thank you really very much for an interesting presentation. I would say our main take now when we are working, I mean, there are so many voices talking about how we should develop the market. And from us as a company, we believe, though, that we believe in the market. We are not giving up the market. We are really, and I think it's important, and I think you also stated that the situation differs between the different regions, and the situation is different, where so you really have to look into the specific development of the market in the region and what is needed. And I think your chart with the 4 characteristics about flexibility and the different technologies showed that here in the Nordic we have a quite unique situation where we can see as looking forward, I would say then, if we see after we have, I would say, used or have closed down the production of the nuclear after they have been more or less aged, so we need to close them down. But so then after that, I can see what we have in the Nordic. We have bio, we have hydro, a lot of hydro, and we will have a lot of wind. And I think that in that combination, it will be a good mix, and I think we can actually more or less work with a energy-only market also for the future. That's how we look at it. But then we have to let the prices go through. We need to have the scarcity prices, as you say. We don't want the politicians to intervene in that. And that is, of course, an issue. Will they or not? And I would say then we should have hourly pricing, so we can also get new services, so we get the customer involved in the market. And of course, we believe, though, that we should have the prices on the externality, let's say the CO2 price. And I think it's too early to give up that. We have, I think at the moment, about, I heard a figure, 12% of the global CO2 emissions that are priced at the moment. But what can we see after Paris? We know that there is quite a lot of these possibilities in the INDCs and suggestion to price. So I won't give up that yet, and I think we have a momentum in Europe to restructure the ETS with a sharper declining of the emission totally. So that is what we believe, and of course, what we see, as I said, for the future, we see at the moment wind and solar is the most economic way to invest in at the moment. Now, and we believe that that will develop with or without subsidies, but we think that we should get out of the subsidies to matured technology, and that we should believe in the market. At the moment we have oversupply, and of course then we shouldn't invest. That's the signal for the investor. We should wait. And we should wait till we see the prices are coming up. And that we believe that is the way forward. I think I stop there at the moment.
Let's go straight to Linda first.
Yes, thank you very much. It was really interesting and important issues. My name is Linda Burenius Magnusson. I work as Head of Public Affairs at OX2. OX2 develops, builds, finances and manages renewable energy plants in Northern Europe. And we strive towards 100% renewable and sustainable energy sector. From a financial and environmental point of view, wind power is currently the primary type of energy used to drive this transition. But we are also involved in solar energy and in bioenergy, where we see great potential as well. The aging nuclear power plants that we have in Sweden, they must be replaced one day. And there is a discussion today about energy security. And therefore, I would say to ensure the long-term energy security, we need the politicians to decide on a roadmap for the transition towards a renewable energy sector. That will mean that we build up an oversupply for a period, but at the same time, we in that way build up energy security, and it also means export incomes. It's a good affair. The condition for an expansion of wind power in Sweden are very good compared with most other EU countries. And the main reasons for that is we have excellent wind conditions, we have low population density, we have good infrastructure in roads and electricity grids, and we have the load balancing from hydropower, which currently the installed capacity of hydro is more than 45%. So the conditions is good, but of course these questions raised in market design and so on are very important, but I also believe it's important to decide the most cost-efficient way to do it. And I am sometimes afraid that in Sweden that we hear some voices that exaggerate the capacity problem. We have quite an intense capacity debate right now, and that these same voices exaggerate the problems with this transition to a renewable energy sector. And we saw a report from Energiforsk recently regarding capacity problems and capacity mechanisms, and their conclusion for us here was that the best would probably be a wait-and-see strategy. And the main reasons for that is that, one, that the introduction of a capacity mechanism would be a major intervention in the market, and two, what I believe maybe is most important, is that our existing capacity reserve, in conjunction with the Swedish hydropower capacity, that means that it will take considerably time before the development of wind and solar will significantly weaken the Swedish capacity balance. So our view is that it is important to line out the roadmap for the transition towards a renewable and sustainable energy sector now, and not to stop this development because we have some aging nuclear power plants. That would be quite an insecure way to go, I would say. And then to introduce the most cost-efficient tools and policies to make this happen regarding market design.
Thank you so much, Linda. Let's turn back to Manuel to get a few comments on the comments, and then we'll open up the floor. Yes, I know somebody is already excited about that.
Yes, thank you very much. I don't want to give the impression that we give up on CO2 pricing. It's not at all what I try to say. Carbon pricing will be interesting, but in a 450 scenario that I presented, the carbon price we should have in this scenario is $100 per ton of CO2. And we don't see this happening in the coming few years in a European context.
That is not needed for the electricity market.
Yeah,
that's for the industry. Maybe.
That's the
so
that's the assumption that we that's the modeling assumption that is used. And so if we can strengthen, the funny thing is that after Paris, you mentioned Paris, I think, the Paris Cup, the CO2 pricing dropped significantly from 8 to 5 euros per ton of CO2 after Paris, while Paris would have been expected to give a signal to the CO2 pricing. So my point is that there is a very important role to play for CO2 pricing. We absolutely need to strengthen and to do what is needed to strengthen the CO2 pricing. In an IEA context, I remember you that we don't have CO2 pricing in all parts of North America. The CO2 pricing discussion in many other countries is very difficult, so we also have to look at situations where CO2 pricing will not be the only driver. And in any case, I think the track record that we have in carbon pricing over the last few years in Europe is not very good in terms of building confidence for investors. But maybe Fortum has another view on this. So we are not giving up at all on CO2 pricing, but it's necessary. We think it will not be sufficient to attract investments. That's the point. When you mentioned scarcity prices, I didn't develop a lot scarcity prices. This is a fundamental element in the discussion. We also know that it's very difficult to avoid government interference with scarcity prices ex post. So governments have a tendency to react and step in when there is actual scarcity prices. And so what we say and what we explain in the publication based on the experience in Australia and ERCOT in Texas is that governments wishing to go in that direction must define ex ante the market rules associated with scarcity pricing. Scarcity pricing doesn't mean that you don't have a price cap. You just need to have the price cap at a very high level consistent with the reliability standards. And you also need to anticipate that we'll have to face market power issues during these times, scarcity hours. And so you need to define in advance, and this is what they do in these examples, how they will deal with market power issues when this actually happens. So let the market work, yes, but you also need to define the rules of the game in advance in order to create confidence for market participants. So this is my answer. I agree that Nordic countries are in a very good situation regarding flexibility thanks to all the hydro that there is here. So there are specificities associated with hydro systems. It would be interesting, I think, to look at what Brazil is doing because Brazil is also an hydro-dominated system. But even in Brazil, they are considering now the question of flexibility because as you put more wind and solar power into the system, and you also have to face droughts in this country, they are also increasingly thinking in terms of capacity as well. It's my understanding of the current situation in Brazil. So capacity and then the capacity market, whether we need or not a capacity market. Wait and see strategy can always be the strategy. If you design capacity markets well, I think you don't have to be that concerned about the cost of capacity markets because if they are well designed and if you are in a situation of excess capacity, then a good test would be to check whether you have a capacity price at zero or not. So there are a lot of discussions in Europe based on what's going on in Germany, for instance, where capacity mechanisms are indeed used for several purposes, not only reliability and adequacy. Our message is that you should use and design capacity markets only to address adequacy issues. And to the extent that we don't, governments or the industry think that there is not enough demand response into the system, then we consider that capacity markets can be useful to create a safety net. Otherwise, there is a risk that during the investment phase of the cycle, you might not meet the reliability standards at all times, all the years. So you might have a loss of load expectation of 8, 10, 12 hours during a couple of years before you start to see new investments coming online. So we still believe that depending on how governments are comfortable or not regarding the lower reliability during a couple of years, some governments in Texas, for instance, could accept this situation, transitory situation. Other governments would not. In the UK, for instance, the reliability standards is defined as the loss of load expectation should be not higher than 3 hours per year. So it's a floor. It's not an average.
Because I think we have the capacity situation in the Nordic is very strong, just as you mentioned. And if we look a little bit in the future, we will now close down 4 reactors to 2020. It might be all the reactors if we don't get the right decisions, but that's the situation.
Reason to start
But
building
for
more renewables.
4 years,
so
that's not the case. But anyway, it will come also in the Finnish reactor on the grid 2018. We have CHP coming in. We have wind coming in. So we have quite even though we closed down 4 now, we have a good situation. So that's why we think it's too early actually to talk about capacity mechanism. Actually, we can talk about having a strategic reserve that we have in Sweden, but then just as you say, and I think that's the important message, we should have that on a regional basis. We shouldn't be Swedish, because if we decide on capacity mechanism, it will be nationally decided, I'm sure. I think it will be very difficult to get that in a coherent way, and that's why we are quite skeptical, because this will mean oversupply, it will be too costly also for the consumer. So that's why we think we should be really cautious before we go into the step of capacity mechanism. So, but then we can discuss the subsidies for renewable or not. But I think at the moment we don't need actually that. It's the most cost efficient is to invest in wind power at the moment.
I just want to comment what I mean. I mean that this threat shutting down all nuclear power plants in 2020, that really shows how vulnerable our system is, because we don't know when. We don't have a date, and we shouldn't have a date. I mean, we can have one more Fukushima with the higher costs for security and so on. We don't know, and if we don't continue building up this oversupply for a while, we will be. I mean, we will be vulnerable in 5 or 10 years as well. So that's my point. But what I was interested in asking you, Manuel, was that you point out many different policies and mechanisms and so on in this report. And would it be possible for you to say what you believe would be the most important policies or mechanisms to introduce in the Nordic region? Is it possible to answer a question like that?
I'm not very familiar with, not enough familiar with the Nordic region, and I think it's very specific because of hydro. You mentioned it. I think it's very true. So in most other regions, hydro has a less important role, and so the story is a little bit different. Especially in terms of flexibility, etc. My key recommendation is what I already said. I mean, if you look at these questions of adequacy and resource adequacy, you should look at it at regional basis. This would be a step back not to do it, given all the achievements that have been reached in Nord Pool in general. So if I want to give only one recommendation, this would be go regional for this discussion.
Thank you for that. Let's have questions from the floor, and to save time, I'll repeat them in the microphone. So we'll go first to Per. To save time, you just shout. Go straight to Manuel.
Quick answer. Electricity is not one product. From my perspective, it's not one commodity product, because you cannot store it, and it depends when you consume it and where you consume it. So it's a very local product, in fact. This is one dimension. If you look at how electricity markets are designed in other countries, so in Mexico, for instance, they are reforming their electricity system right now, and they have at the same time the objective to introduce competition and to also develop what they call clean energy, and clean energy includes their renewables and nuclear. And they define the electricity products with 3 dimensions. The first one is energy. The second one is capacity. And the third one is the clean nature of electricity. So they have 3 products that can be sold by each generator using an auctioning, long-term auctioning system. And I find this system very interesting because you have an integrated design of the market, recognizing the different dimensions of the product. What Europe didn't have so far, because Europe started with liberalization to be able to exchange energy, mainly across borders in the first step. And then came the question of low carbon investments, but so we had additional policies but not very well integrated. And now we have the discussion about electricity security, reliability and capacity markets.
Thank you. Let's have a few questions at pop here. You first and then immediately to you. Yes, you. Thank you. Let's have one more question. Who was it here? Who was it? It was you.
Thank you. I'd like to raise the issue of technological development, which you indicated in the beginning as regards capacity and storage and variability and so on. That is to ask you what assumptions you've made, because just the other day the Indian Minister of Energy said that solar power is now, with some caveats, is now cheaper than coal power. In northern Morocco, we have the Ouarzazate plant, which will be reaching half the capacity of a traditional nuclear power plant, and with generation being cheaper than transmission and so on. So if this tremendous development continues in the next few years, how will all of this change? How much do you factor that in?
Thank you. Third question before we leave the floor to Manuel. Yes.
You talked about the vast different varieties of different policy measures in place in Europe. Is there a reason to try to streamline those, or is it necessary to have different types of policies and regulations in different areas?
Okay, so many questions.
Go.
We have 5 minutes left. Okay. So we think that in order to develop the power system flexibility, in order to integrate increasing shares of renewables, that we will have to do that. It's easier in Nordic countries, but we'll have to couple electricity system with other systems. In this report, we look only at the electricity sector, so we don't go in that discussion very far. We treat this as demand response. And in practice, from a system perspective, electricity system perspective, you can also see storage as a form of demand response and load shifting. So we have this perspective. We didn't try to look at everything. My colleagues at the IEA are doing this much better than I do. So in terms of definition of market design, market rules and regulation, we have to look at the electricity sector. But the answer to your question is to look at demand response and storage mainly, including batteries and electric vehicles, of course. Regarding the fact that solar power is cheaper than coal, I think this is true in a number of countries, including in Mexico. I was in Mexico, so I mentioned Mexico, I have this in mind. This is true on an LCOE basis, on a levelized cost of electricity basis. This is true because you have an institutional setting and long-term arrangements that keep the cost of financing low. If you start to invest in solar PV using a carbon price, then maybe investors will ask a higher risk premium on investments in order to compensate the uncertainty associated with carbon price, which is a bit weird because you have to pay 2 times. To pay carbon price, which is a political construct, and you also have to pay higher costs in terms of the risk premium on investments. So this is true on an LCOE basis with long-term PPAs. What I tried to explain is that LCOE is relatively misleading as a concept to assess the competitiveness of wind and solar power. When you deploy the first few % of wind and solar power into systems, up to 5%, this is not an issue. You can use LCOE, doesn't matter a lot. When we are talking about extreme decarbonization scenarios with shares of 20, 25 for solar PV or more for variable renewable energy sources in general, then you cannot continue to use only this LCOE concept. For your information, we published a book last year called Projected Cost of Generating Electricity, where we do calculate LCOEs for solar PV and wind, and we compare this with base load generation technologies. But in the second part of the book, we explain why we shouldn't have done that. So I invite you to read about this. And the key concept is a question of value. What will be the value as you increase the share of variable renewable energy? I'm not talking about biomass, etc., and hydro, but variable renewable energy sources, wind and solar power. Their value for the system decreases if you don't have enough flexibility. So you have to take this into account, not looking only at costs, which can be misleading. And the last question was transportation. I think I also started to answer this. I don't remember the last question.
Transportation, if you are counting that also.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. No. The streamlining. Yeah. Sorry. Yes. There are things you can do in Europe with 29 countries. And things you cannot do. I think Europe tried to do it with network codes. They tried to go as far as they could with the network codes. Basically, the idea was to harmonize many dimensions of detailed technical regulations for the electricity system, from balancing to security of supply, connection, etc. The network codes remain relatively general, because it's difficult, of course, to harmonize things when you have 29 countries. I definitely think that we can do a better job with regions, different regions. And this is a big discussion at the moment at European level, how to define these regions. It's pretty obvious in a Nordic context, but in other part of Europe, it's less obvious. So the solution in terms of regulation, harmonization or regulation, going further in terms of integrating market rules, etc., is definitely for me a regional question.
Those are the famous last words for this session. Thank you ever so much, Manuel Baritaud, Birgitta Resvik, Linda Borenius Magnusson. Give them a warm. We have a climate to solve and an energy market to fix. At the exact same time as we were discussing this, the Energikommissionen is discussing the same thing, so we got very valuable input for that. Strictly for the 2030 partners, in 5 minutes we're going to start the session on the transport sector here with Manuel, and strictly for 100% förnybart, our co-organizers of this afternoon, there's the board meeting up there. And for all the rest of you, thank you ever so much for coming.